Hi, I'm Nick Weber with Anabranch Solutions. Thanks for joining me for short discussion today on choosing indicators, clarifying goals and objectives in LTPBR projects. So, quick outline. I'm going to talk about just why goals and objectives, their role in LTPBR projects, and then I'm also going to talk about just kind of framing effective objectives. So that's it. And if you want to refer to a chapter in the manual, Chapter 3, Planning. Okay, so why goals and objectives? First, expectation management. I want to roll back to Module 2C, where you heard about Bridge Creek and the pretty phenomenal and inspiring outcomes. Really shown by these before-after photos. So yeah, we all want to do this, right? And we want to reimagine these incredible outcomes for our riverscape. But we got to have reasonable expectations, and so thinking through these objectives can help temper those expectations for you and your partners, and help you communicate those ideas. Because it may not be like this. Bridge Creek had beavers that were really busy, and we could not have done this on our own. Okay, so goals and objectives, and many of you know this, right? The language of goals and objectives are it's just an integral part and just very entrenched part of funding and also permit acquisition. So if you're going to do restoration, you probably are going to have to make succinct and effective statements of goals and objectives. So learning how to do this well is key. Prioritization of limited resources, right? None of us have as much money as we really would love to have for restoration. So how do you prioritize? Well, we've talked about in planning, thinking about recovery potential, right? How much of the valley bottom could you reclaim is recoverable, right? Expansion of your riverscape. So this could be expressed as something like total area or percent of total area of the valley bottom. So we could just look at those things for different reaches on a graph, right? Valley bottom area, valley bottom proportion of recovery potential. So where would we want to spend our restoration dollars comparing these three reaches? This one, right? It's got the biggest potential. So we can use our objectives to prioritize maybe where to really invest restoration dollars. So also goals and objectives, they're just, throughout the life of these, you've seen this terrible figure, part of the conservation planning process. Your objectives and whether you're achieving them or not are going to drive all these phases. They're just key. All these questions, a lot of times the answers lie within the objectives that you specified. You're going to hear more about this, especially in Module 5F that's coming up as part of this workshop. Okay, so how do we go about framing good objectives? Well, I bet a lot of you have heard about SMART objectives. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. So we're going to step through these. We're going to do it within the context of a really cool LTPBR design that was done for the Willow Springs Preserve on Whychus Creek in Central Oregon. It's a Deschutes River tributary. Really great teaching spot because you can really see this idea of like active floodplain to your valley bottom width. So where is your recovery potential? It's such a perfect example. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, and we're going to do it also in the context of this big table, which is a table of indicators and different time horizons. And these are kind of our objectives at different time horizons. So we're going to step through these, so not in order. So let's go back to SMART. We want our objectives to be relevant, that is clearly linked to goals. So let's review goals for our Whychus project. So first, and just remember, your goals may be totally different on your project, right? On this project, we have increased stage 0 as part of our channel evolution model. It's because our collaborators, they understand stage 0 and place importance on it, but in many cases that may not be. But we have this as a goal: increase stage 0. Promote riverscape principles. This is things like streams need space, or structure forces complexity and resilience, right? So we want to just, as a goal, we just promote those riverscape principles. And goal 3 was something very tangible, probably very common, a focus species. In this case, it's increase habitat quantity for these listed salmon and steelhead that use the watershed. So these are our high-level goals for Willow Springs. And so within our indicator table, yeah, we have, indicators that are linked to goals. So for example, goal 3, fish habitat quantity and quality, we have a couple indicators, wetted channel length, habitat quantity, spawning habitat quantity. So a couple indicators linked to each goal, right? So that's our relevance. Time bound, we want our objectives to be bound by time frame. So here in our indicator table, we have these different time horizons, right? Existing, so what are the current conditions? An as-built condition, so just after restoration. And then these kind of process-based medium and long-term expectations. And, these are really important to communicate because most people don't think about outcomes 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years. But in a lot of times with process-based restoration, that's the reality. And so, again, really important to establish these types of expectations and communicate them to your funders, your collaborators. Okay, so how do you go about developing timeframes? One way is, because it's process-based restoration, let's think a little bit about the frequency and magnitude of different processes. Obviously, discharge, right? Your flow regime. So these are different graphs showing, when do big floods happen? What's the recurrence interval? Can I expect a few medium floods in 3 years? When do I get big floods every 5 years? That's going to help you establish expectations. I wanted to point out that, most of these little streams you're going to do these projects on won't have great historic discharge information. Stream stats, you can pull a lot of these kind of flood interval metrics straight off this USGS website. I think that's explained more in the manual as well. Great resource. Just an example. Another thing is just very practical considerations, like, when are things happening? You're going to do a pilot and phase treatments. When are those going to happen? What makes sense? What's your implementation schedule? When are riparian planting treatments going to happen? What's your expectation for establishment of riparian vegetation? When are grazing management or beaver management plans going to be enacted as part of your overall process-based design? Okay, so these types of timelines are good graphical ways that can help to start establish your timeframes for your objectives. Okay, achievable. Are our objectives just geomorphically and biologically possible? So we've already, as part of planning, talked about great starting points for this, right? This is just an example, but it can help contextualize what's achievable. So this is defining your valley bottom, your ultimate capacity for the riverscape to adjust, right? But then more importantly, establishing your recovery potential. That is, what do you think how much of the riverscape can be in play within some shortened timeline as a result of restoration. So these planning exercises really put you on the road and establish the starting point for what's achievable. And that's just one example of an exercise you may go through. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about, we want things to be specific and measurable. So let's just go back to our indicator table. In terms of measurable, I just want to note that, we've put real units on all of our indicators, and, our objectives are, based on those units. So dams per mile for beaver dam densities, percent of the valley bottom area that's active floodplain and channel, right? So these are very doable, very measurable units for each indicator metric. So, things you're familiar with. Also want to note here, you'll see that in many cases we have expressed our objectives and also historic expectations as a range, right? 90% plus or minus 10. These are ecological processes. If you think that you can predict the number of large wood accumulations down to, very, very accurately, you're probably fooling yourself. We're relying on natural processes. we should specify these things as a range. It just makes much more sense in terms of process-based restoration and collaborating with these processes. So being specific, but not overly specific, I guess is where we want to go. And that's key again for communicating with your partners and collaborators as part of these projects. Okay, so lastly, let's just go, I'm going to go over graphically how we may think about establishing these values, these objective values for our beaver dam density indicator. Okay, so this graph really does just kind of express what we may expect for dam abundances, right, as part of a LTPBR project. So first off, we need some idea of what are historic, and this graph expresses dam abundances over time, and in terms of artificial dams, natural dams, and then the sum of both of those is total dams, right? And so historically, we need some idea of what beaver dams were. Well, you saw Brad earlier in the workshop, the beaver restoration assessment tool, based on catchment and climate and vegetative characteristics, we can get an idea of, what is a reasonable expectation for natural beaver dam abundances. And notice that here, total dams and natural dams are tracking, right? So we expect them to just, due to trapping and removal, they completely fell off historically. And then comes our amazing restoration efforts. So here, all of a sudden, we have, artificial dams, very punctuated increase in a first phase of restoration, and then a second phase of restoration, right? Very punctuated increase. And now total dams are tracking artificial dams. As part of this project, we have beaver relocation. So at some point after our initial implementation, we're expecting natural dams to start being built, right? Also, we know that these BDA structures are expected to be temporary. So at some point after flood events, we're losing some BDA structures, so they begin to decrease. And at some point, we have this handoff, right? So the dominant source of structure becomes natural beaver dams instead of artificial. So this is that handoff to natural processes. This is what we're trying to get to as part of these projects. And then, again, here we are at these 5 to 10 year expectations. We're hoping to achieve and then sustain some sort of, close to historic structural abundances as a natural process. And now we have done our job, and we can let natural process take over and maintain our dynamic, healthy riverscape. Okay, so those are the kinds of values, right, that will feed right into this kind of an indicator table. And that is an oversimplification of how we might get these values, but hopefully it puts it into kind of context. Okay, that is all we have for project objectives. Again, it's kind of an oversimplification, but I hope it is useful. Thanks again.